Welcome to This Day in His Story, created by American Heritage Worldwide, a reminder that every day holds something new to learn. Did you know that in 1987, President Ronald Reagan stood at the Berlin Wall and boldly told Soviet leaders to tear down this wall? Learn the results of this inspired challenge that helped to end the Cold War and encourage the fall of communism in Eastern Europe. See how opportunities for growth and communication occurred when forced borders were opened and free elections changed lives everywhere in Eastern Europe.
Picture this for a second. It's June 12th, 1987. There's a man standing in West Berlin, and you've got the Brandenburg Gate right there behind him. He's staring down this massive concrete wall, and he's demanding that the leader of a superpower just tear it down.
It's one of the most iconic images of the entire 20th century, maybe the defining image of the 80s.
It is. But if you sort of rewind the tape on this guy's life, the picture gets a little unexpected. You see a guy who spent years memorizing lines for Hollywood B movies.
Mm-hmm.
You see a high school kid in Illinois whistle around his neck, pulling drowning swimmers out of a river. And you see a world leader who famously kept a jar of jelly beans on his desk.
It's a resume that really shouldn't work.
Yes.
I mean, if you pitch that character in a script, a studio exec would probably tell you it's too unbelievable. It just feels disjointed.
Exactly. But today, we are going to dive deep into that script. We're talking about the 40th President of the United States, Ronald Reagan. And looking at the stack of sources we have here, biographies, speech drafts, historical analysis, we're not just going to walk through a timeline.
No, because, the dates are easy. You can find those on Wikipedia. Our mission today is to figure out the how. How did a boy nicknamed Dutch become the great communicator?
Yes.
And how did a background in lifeguarding and acting, which seems totally unrelated to geopolitics, how did that actually create the toolkit he used to reshape the Cold War?
That is the million-dollar question. So whether you're a history buff who knows every single cabinet member or you're just sort of wondering how a movie star ends up running the free world, stick with us. We're going to connect those dots.
Let's start at the beginning.
Illinois, 1911.
Tampico, Illinois, February 6, 1911. He's born in a small apartment above a bakery. And you mentioned the nickname Dutch in the intro.
Yeah, I've always been curious about that. Was there a Dutch ancestry thing?
Surprisingly, no. According to the notes here, his father, Jack Reagan, took one look at his newborn son, who's apparently a pretty chubby baby, and just said, he looks like a fat little Dutchman.
That's blunt. Fathers in 1911 really didn't mince words, did they?
Apparently not, but it stuck. He was Dutch to his friends and family for decades. While his father gave him the name, the sources really suggest it was his mother, Nell, who gave him his worldview.
Kind of the default setting of his personality, so to speak.
That's a great way to put it. Nell Reagan was deeply religious and just incredibly optimistic. She was very involved in her church, and she instilled this idea in him that there was a divine plan for his life. Reagan later wrote that she always expected to find the best in people and often did.
That optimism is such a huge theme in the documents we have. It feels like it wasn't just a mood for him. It was like a strategy.
Mm-hmm.
But I want to zoom in on something more tangible from his youth. We always hear about presidents having these summer jobs, scooping ice cream or whatever, but Reagan's job in Dixon, Illinois was intense.
You're talking about Lowell Park? The Rock River?
The Rock River. He worked as a lifeguard. And the number that just jumps out from the research is 77.
77 lives saved.
I had to double check that number because it sounds inflated. It sounds like a tall tale. But the sources are specific. He would notch a mark on a log for every single person he pulled out.
And the Rock River wasn't some calm swimming pool. It had these treacherous currents. So these weren't minor assists where he's just handing someone a floaty. These were people actually being swept away.
What stands out to me isn't just the athleticism, though. It's the psychology of it. Imagine doing that 77 times.
It changes you. It has to. It creates this self-image of being the protector, the hero. There's a psychological profile in the reading list that suggests this really cemented his desire to be the one who jumps in when things are going wrong.
Right. It's a very physical manifestation of that drive.
Exactly. And he didn't leave that energy behind when he went to college either. He went to Eureka College.
A small school, right?
Yeah, a small, private, Christian liberal arts school in Illinois. And if you look at his activity list, it's exhausting just to read it.
It truly is. He majored in economics and sociology, but then you look at the extracurriculars, football team, track team. captain of the swim team, of course,
Naturally.
student council president, and leading roles in school plays.
And that intersection right there, sports and theater, that is really the key to understanding Reagan. In sports, you learn teamwork, competition. In theater, you learn projection, timing, how to hold an audience. He was unconsciously building the perfect skill set for public office decades before he ever ran for anything.
So after graduating in 1932, right in the thick of the Great Depression, he doesn't go into politics. He goes into
Gotcha.
radio.
Which was the dominant medium of the time. He started in Iowa, eventually wound up announcing for the Chicago Cubs.
Yeah.
And this is where the great communicator really starts to form.
How so?
Yeah.
Because calling a baseball game seems pretty different from giving a State of the Union.
Well, think about baseball on the radio in the 1930s. He wasn't always at the stadium. A lot of the time, he'd be sitting in a studio in Des Moines just reading these telegraph updates, strike one, ball two, and he had to invent the rest.
So he had to sell it.
He had to visualize the crack of the bat, the crowd noise, the weather, and sell it to the listener. He was painting pictures with words. He learned that if you speak with enough conviction and clarity, the audience will see what you see. That's a superpower when you eventually transition to politics.
But the radio booth wasn't the final destination. In 1937, he makes the big move. West. Hollywood.
He takes his screen test for Warner Brothers, and just like that, a 7-year contract.
It sounds so easy in hindsight. He goes on to make over 50 movies. He's the Gipper. But there's a gap in the filmography, isn't there? World War II.
Right, and this is a detail that often gets glossed over. Reagan was an officer in the Army Reserve, so when the war breaks out, he gets called up. But he never sees combat overseas.
Because of his eyes.
His eyesight was terrible, extremely nearsighted, so he was disqualified from frontline duty. But the Army didn't just waste him. They sent him to the 1st Motion Picture Unit in Culver City.
So he's fighting the war with a camera.
In a way, yeah. He made training films. One of the sources highlights a film called For God and Country from 1943. He was basically simulating combat to train the guys who were actually going. It just reinforces that theme again. Reagan's contribution was always about messaging, morale, and communication.
Okay, so the war ends, he goes back to Hollywood, but the world is changing. And this is where I think the most critical pivot happens. If you ask most people, how did Reagan prepare for the presidency? They'll probably say, he was governor. But the sources suggest his real political boot camp was the Union.
The Screen Actors Guild. This is absolutely vital. He served as president of the Guild for nearly 6 years.
And this wasn't some ceremonial role where he just, cut ribbons at movie premieres.
Not at all. This was the late 40s and 50s. Hollywood was a battleground. You had labor strikes, you had mob influence trying to get into the industry, and you had the Red Scare, the fear of communist infiltration.
So he's sitting across the table negotiating with studio moguls who were absolute sharks.
He wasn't memorizing lines here. He was negotiating contracts, managing huge egos, conflicting interests. It moved him from the soundstage to the boardroom. The sources note this is where his politics began to shift. He started as a liberal Democrat, a big FDR fan.
Right.
But dealing with the bureaucracy of the unions and the anti-communist sentiment, it pushed him to the right. By the time he resigns from the Guild in 1960, the politician Reagan has effectively been born.
It's fascinating because it means he understood the working mechanics of negotiation long before he ever held public office. He switches parties, becomes a Republican, and eventually serves 2 terms as governor of California.
Which economically is basically like running a mid-sized country. It was the proving ground. Yeah.
Which brings us to 1980, the presidency. He wins against Jimmy Carter. And at age 69, he becomes the oldest president-elect in history up to that point.
He takes office in January '81. He promises a new era of American strength. But frankly, he barely has time to unpack his bags before everything almost comes to a tragic end.
March 30th, 1981, the assassination attempt.
It's almost impossible to overstate how chaotic that day was.
He's leaving the Washington Hilton, he's walking to the limo,
Yeah.
and John Hinckley Jr. just opens fire. The raw footage of this is terrifying.
It happens in seconds. The Secret Service training just kicks in immediately. They shove the president into the back of the limousine. And initially, Reagan didn't even realize he'd been shot. He thought he'd broken a rib when the agent landed on top of him.
But the damage was catastrophic. The sources say the bullet ricocheted off the limo, entered under his arm, pierced a lung, and stopped an inch from his heart.
An inch. He lost over half his blood volume. When he walked into the George Washington University Hospital, and he did walk in, which is honestly a testament to his acting skills trying to project strength, he collapsed almost immediately. He was right on the brink of death.
This is the moment where the Dutch character study really pays off. Most people in that situation would be panicking, but Reagan, he starts cracking jokes.
It's legendary. When Nancy arrives at the ER, terrified, he looks at her and says, "Honey, I forgot to duck."
Which is a line from the boxer Jack Dempsey. He's quoting pop culture while he's bleeding out.
And it didn't stop there. He's being wheeled into the operating room, surrounded by surgeons in masks, about to be cut open. He looks up at them and says, "I hope you are all Republicans."
That is just an incredible presence of mind. And I love the response from the head surgeon, Joseph Giordano.
Right, Giordano was a liberal Democrat. But he looked at the president and said, "Today, Mr. President, we are all Republicans."
It gives you chills. But why do you think he did that? Was it just a defense mechanism?
I think it was deeper than that. The sources analyze this as a strategic use of humor. By making those jokes, he wasn't just calming himself down. He was calming the doctors, his staff, and, eventually the nation. He was signaling, "I am still me. I am in control." It turned a moment of vulnerability into a display of strength.
And physically, he bounced back incredibly fast.
Remarkably fast for a 70-year-old. The doctor said it was his physical condition, a lifetime of being active, chopping wood at his ranch, swimming. He was back to work within weeks.
And getting back to work meant dealing with a massive agenda. We should briefly mention he appointed Sandra Day O'Connor to the Supreme Court, the first woman ever to hold that seat.
A major milestone. But the defining challenge of his presidency was, without a doubt, the Cold War.
Okay, let's set the stage here. The world is divided. East versus West, communism versus democracy. And the struggle of that division wasn't a metaphor. It was just concrete.
The Berlin Wall. It had been standing since 1961, cutting Berlin in half. It was a prison wall, with guard towers, kill zones. For the Soviet Union, it was a necessary buffer. For the West, it was a moral outrage.
So jump forward to June 12, 1987. Reagan travels to West Berlin.
Now, the backstory on this speech is fascinating. The State Department and the National Security Council were terrified of what Reagan wanted to say.
They thought he was going to be too aggressive.
Exactly. The diplomats wanted to play it safe. They didn't want to provoke Mikhail Gorbachev, the Soviet leader. The drafts of the speech went back and forth. They kept taking out the tear down this wall line. They thought it was too provocative, too cowboy.
But Reagan kept putting it back in.
He knew his audience. And his audience wasn't just the diplomats. It was the people of East Berlin and the world watching on TV. He trusted his instincts over the experts.
So he stands at the Brandenburg Gate, and the rhetoric he uses is so distinct. He doesn't talk about treaties or grain shipments. He talks about a scar.
He personalized it. He said, "It is not the German question alone that remains open, but the question of freedom for all mankind." He raised the stakes to a moral absolute.
And then the delivery.
He calls out Gorbachev directly. "General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, come here to this gate."
And then that hammer drop. "Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall."
You can hear the crowd roar in the recording. It was forceful, direct, and simple. And that is the great communicator at his peak. He didn't use academic jargon. He used simple, imperative sentences.
So did it work?
Well, correlation isn't always causation, but the timeline is striking. The speech was in June 1987. Just over 2 years later, in November 1989, the wall came down.
And by 1991, the Soviet Union dissolves. The Cold War ends.
It was a massive geopolitical shift. Now, obviously, Reagan didn't do it alone. You had internal economic collapse in the Soviet Union. You had the bravery of dissidents in Poland and elsewhere. But there is no denying that Reagan's willingness to challenge the moral legitimacy of the Soviet system accelerated that collapse. He pushed when others just wanted to manage the status quo.
So we have the lifeguard, the union boss, the Cold Warrior. But you can't really understand Reagan without looking at the other half of the equation. Nancy.
No, you can't. They married in 1952 after his divorce from the actress Jane Wyman, and Nancy was. She was essential.
The sources describe them as a husband-wife team, but it feels more intense than that.
It was. Nancy was his fierce protector. While Reagan was the optimist, always seeing the best in people, Nancy was the personnel director. She was the one watching his back, firing people she thought didn't serve him well, managing his schedule. She created the bubble of safety that allowed him to be Ronald Reagan.
And the romance was clearly genuine. I was reading about the letters.
Yeah, he wrote her love letters constantly, even after decades of marriage. There is a beautiful line where he writes, "We haven't been careless with the treasure that is ours, namely, what we are to each other."
That is poetry. It really humanizes the man in the suit. And speaking of humanizing details, we have to talk about the candy.
The jelly bean.
It's such a weirdly specific detail for a president.
It actually started when he was running for governor. He gave up pipe smoking and needed a substitute to, keep his hands and mouth busy. He started eating jelly beans.
And it just escalated from there.
It did. By the time he was in the White House, he had a standing order for jelly belly beans, specifically that brand. Something like 720 bags a month were shipped to the White House. He used them as icebreakers in meetings. You'd have these high-stakes negotiations, and he'd slide a jar across the desk and say, "Do you want a jelly bean?"
It's disarming.
Completely. It breaks the tension. It fits that persona of the approachable, regular guy, just Dutch, from Illinois, even when he's the most powerful man on earth.
The end of his life, however, was much quieter and much sadder.
In 1994, he wrote a letter to the American people revealing that he had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease.
I remember that letter. He wrote that he was beginning the journey that would lead him into the sunset of his life.
It was a brave thing to do at the time, to be so public about such a vulnerable condition. Nancy became his voice and his caretaker as he slowly slipped away. He passed away on June 5th, 2004, at the age of 93.
And Nancy followed him in 2016. They're buried together now at the Presidential Library in Simi Valley, looking out over the hills.
A fitting end for a man who always looked west, physically and metaphorically.
So when we step back and look at this whole deep dive, we've covered a lot of ground. From a lifeguard stand on the Rock River to the Brandenburg Gate. What's the big takeaway here?
For me, it's about the power of consistency and communication. You see a through line. The boy who learned to read the river currents became the actor who learned to read an audience, who became the politician who learned to read the global mood.
He took skills that a lot of people dismissed, acting, storytelling, and proved they were actually essential leadership tools.
Right. He didn't win the Cold War with some new weapon system, although he certainly built those too. He won it largely with words. He defined the conflict in a way that made the outcome seem inevitable. He used humor to deflect fear. He used simple language to convey complex morals.
It's a reminder that leadership isn't just about policy papers. It's about how you make people feel.
And keeping that optimism, that belief that the best is yet to come, even when you're staring at a wall or a surgeon's scalpel.
That's a powerful thought. And that leads us to the question we want to leave you with today. We saw how Reagan used humor, forgot to duck, and direct challenges, tear down this wall, to navigate massive crises.
So think about your own life. When the pressure is on, when the stakes are high, what's your default setting? Do you retreat into technical details? Do you panic? Or do you find a way to connect?
Because as we saw with the lifeguard from Illinois, the way you say something can change the outcome of the situation, and sometimes it can even change history. Thank you for joining us for this day in his story. May the lessons of yesterday inspire you to see God's hand today and to play your part in his story now. For more faith-based learning, visit ahsworldwide.org, the homeschool for faith and family.